Okay, so we are discussing spiritual awakening. And if I don't answer all of your questions in this first one, you'll have time to ask those questions at the end, as well as let me know what you want me to include in the next presentation. We'll see how many presentations I have to do on this subject. It's quite extensive, more so than I even imagined. So first of all, I want to discuss what is spiritual awakening, because we need to get a definition right off the bat here. Here is the way this Frontiers in Psychology website defines it, and I think it's pretty good. Spiritual awakening is a term given to describe a subjective experience in which an individual's ego transcends their ordinary finite sense of self to encompass a wider, infinite sense of truth or reality. These deeply embodied noetic experiences, and noetic is a fancy term for mental activity. Noetic experiences are often perceived as a direct connection, communion, or non-dual merging with an unlimited and universal consciousness, the divine, or God in perceived oneness. Now, those of you who've been with me for a while know that I love Odilon Redon, that wonderful artist who is a mystic as well. So I'm going to be using many of his works for this presentation. He was indeed a mystic and expressed much of his own spiritual journey through his art. Now, I want to mention right off the bat that there is a sort of rare experience referred to as a spontaneous spiritual awakening, which seems to occur in an instant. And the Western spiritual paths have often burdened its followers with such an expectation of the spiritual journey. And I'm going to discuss the why of that in a moment. But for most of us, spiritual awakening occurs because we become seekers. Why do we become seekers? Because we become aware at some point that our life, as it is currently experienced, isn't satisfying. We reach a point where we say to ourselves, there has to be more to it than this. Maybe this happens very early in life. Maybe it happens during a midlife crisis. Maybe this happens after a formative event, like a psychological or spiritual earthquake. It unsettles the terra firma, the solid existential ground we've stood on up to that point in our life. We lose our job. We get a divorce. A loved one dies unexpectedly. But it could also happen purely from an intellectual journey of investigation into who we are and what is our place in this world. And in this journey, we explore what the ego is, this sense of who we are, that there is a part of ourself that is not the ego. That is the moment of awareness. And it is the very seed that, when nurtured and cultivated, leads to awakening. Let all who seek, seek until they find. That is how the ancient word calls us to spiritual awakening. No matter the cause, the catalyst of our seeking, seek. If we are determined to find whatever we consider the ultimate, the truth of existence, the divine, whatever you want to call it, we will find it if we persist. Now, this begs an important question. Is spiritual awakening worth the time and effort? I mean, I don't want to presume anything. So ask yourself that question right now. Is spiritual awakening worth your time and effort? Remember, we discussed previously that living with a strong ego ultimately results in less than optimal living. Yet we also fear losing a part of ourselves that we treasure if we pursue any path that would diminish ego. We know we will lose much of our self-inflicted suffering if our ego dies and is reborn, but we will lose our familiar old self too. Is the devil we know really worse than the potential saint we might become? see here. I'm missing a slide, so I apologize here. Well, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. Sorry. Okay, the classical example that has created the Western template for spiritual awakening is the conversion of Saul of Tarsus into Paul the Apostle. Now, at first glance, and indeed how it has been understood over 2,000 years, is that this is an instant of spontaneous, instantaneous, and complete awakening. Take a look at this painting. Look at the mayhem of this event. Saul, as Paul was known at the time of this event, had been persecuting members of the Jesus movement. It had only been a few years since the death of Jesus, but Saul feels that it is a great enough threat to the sanctity of his Jewish faith to violently stamp it out. He believes, honestly, that he's doing a good, righteous thing. And then, on his way to arrest members of the Christian community in Damascus, Syria, he has a vision or an encounter, whatever you want to call it, but it involves a tremendous light that appears to him. And in that light is Jesus the Christ, and it is so bright that it blinds Paul. See, look at this. He's fallen from his horse and he can't get up. And the other ruffians in his gang hear the voice from heaven or from someplace, but cannot see what Saul has seen. The whole party is thrown into confusion. Here's how it is described in the book of Acts. Meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now, as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The reply came, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, but get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice, but saw no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. For 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank. Now, this dramatic description of spiritual awakening was not written by Paul himself, but we actually do have Paul's own words about his awakening experience. And here they are. "For I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel that was proclaimed by me is not of human origin, for I did not receive it from a human source, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. You have heard, no doubt, of my earlier life in Judaism. I was violently persecuting the church of God and was trying to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many among my people of the same age, for I was far more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors." Okay, let me pause for a moment here. Saul, as he's known at this point, is an intense seeker of spiritual truth. Okay, he has been doing that for many, many years in his life. He is a true seeker, and this is where it has led him. "But when God, who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his son to me so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles, I did not confer with any human being, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were already apostles before me, but I went away at once into Arabia, and afterwards I returned to Damascus." Okay, that's it. That's Paul's account of his own conversion, okay? No description of a flashing light, no vision of Christ, he doesn't mention it, no booming voice from heaven, at least he doesn't mention it. Nothing but the Son and his revelation, his teaching was revealed to me. All right, come on, Paul, flesh it out for us. I mean, you have a bestseller on your hands. If you just give us all the light, the vision, the voice, the wild details. Well, I guess Paul wasn't thinking like a good financial opportunist. But thankfully, the writer of Acts knew how to tell a good story. This image from the great Baroque painter Caravaggio, I believe, reflects more Paul's own account of the event. He says something very critical for our understanding of his spiritual awakening. He says, I went away to Arabia and afterwards to Damascus. And this ended up being 3 years after this dramatic moment. Arabia in this context does not mean Saudi Arabia, but everything from the Sinai Peninsula to southern Jordan. And some scholars believe he went to Mount Sinai, the place where Moses received the 10 Commandments. Other scholars believe he went to the ancient city of Petra, which was considered part of Arabia in the classical world. I've been to Petra, and I could definitely enjoy it for a while, though it's not the hustling, bustling place it was in Paul's day. Well, let's continue with the final key information. He says, then after 3 years, I did go up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas. Now that's Peter, the apostle Peter. Cephas, and stayed with him 15 days, but I did not see any other apostle except James, the Lord's brother. And in what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown by sight to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only heard it said, the one who formerly was persecuting us is now proclaiming the faith he once tried to destroy. And they glorified God because of me. In other words, Paul disappeared for about 3 years after this dramatic moment. Well, if such an event happened to me, I might need a long period myself to process what had happened to me. Wouldn't you? The reason I'm pointing this out is because we've all been led to believe that spiritual awakening should occur in an instant, largely due to this understanding of this story. It appears that Paul had an instantaneous spiritual awakening, but it's more complex than that. It was more of a process. Here's how the whole spiritual awakening of Saul of Tarsus into St. Paul appears to me. He has been for many years intensely seeking the truth within his Jewish faith. He then experiences a dramatic breakthrough where he experiences through a revelation of some kind, a profound realization that this Jesus of Nazareth, whom he thought was a charlatan, is indeed the Christ, the Messiah, sent to deliver the Jewish people. The Christ appears as a light, which always results in moving from a state of ignorance of oneself and the truth of the world and cosmos to experiential knowledge. Gnosis is the Greek word for it, experiential knowledge of the true reality about oneself and about life, existence as a whole. The voice that he hears, whether it is real, whether it was like an audible voice or not, refers to the communication of this new truth about reality. And yet it has so rattled him that he needs to go off for a few years in order to make sense of it. All the years of seeking that came before, and then this making sense of it after a dramatic moment, is also a critical part of spiritual awakening. In fact, I think it is the most important part for our own growth and spiritual evolution. So it turns out that spiritual awakening is not so much an instantaneous event, but a process. Now, sure, there are such rare occasions, as I mentioned before, known as spontaneous spiritual awakening, like what occurred to the modern mystic Eckhart Tolle. I don't know how you pronounce his last name, Eckhart Tolle, I believe. I was going to discuss his experience in this presentation, but it turns out I don't have time, but I will mention him next week and the experience that he had. But these spontaneous spiritual awakenings are not the norm. We have a method available to us in order to bring about spiritual awakening that doesn't rely on being the rare and exceptional recipient of a spiritual zap from heaven. My point is that what we often think of as something that should take place in an instant, a spiritual awakening, is indeed a process, sometimes taking many years. And here are the classical stages of that process, as laid out by Evelyn Underhill in her classic book, Mysticism, a study of the nature and development of man's spiritual consciousness. That's the old subtitle. Now, there are many different variations of this list that you see here that you'll find on the web, and they range from 3 to 7 stages generally. But no matter how they are divided or arranged, or the terminology they use, they all contain similar characteristics. The awakening of the self to consciousness or awareness of a transcendent or divine reality. That's the first stage. We discover that we are not alone. In fact, we are connected to a greater web of life, and possibly connected to the creative energy, which is the source of all that exists. And that creative energy just might be intelligent and personal. And this is where our ego, formed by this dualistic view and experience of life, begins to break down. This experience, sometimes sudden, sometimes not, is often emotionally rich, well-marked, and characterized by intense feelings of joy and elation. Now, I want to make this clear. We often believe such a moment is random or spontaneous, but actually many people have come to awakening through a purely deliberate intellectual journey, through philosophical or scientific reasoning. The Christian apologist C.S. Lewis comes to mind in this regard. The next stage is purgation. Purgation is the stage of self-purification, of getting rid of the muck, the sludge of negative energy that's within us. It's not simply negative energy inflicted upon us or inherited by us, but it is negative energy that we have produced ourselves as well. Now, traditionally, that energy is referred to as sin or karma. Whatever term you want to use, we need to get rid of it if we want to be whole. When we awaken, we not only become aware of transcendent forces and energies, but we become self-aware. And we realize that we have a smaller self that hasn't been congruent with our higher self. The realization leads to both guilt and also a desire to become congruent, to live up to our values, to live up to that idealistic image we have of ourselves. We now become drawn to the good, the noble, the virtuous. In the words of Evelyn Underhill, the self, aware for the first time of divine beauty, realizes by contrast its own finiteness and imperfection, the manifold illusions in which it is immersed, the immense distance which separates it from the one. It attempts to eliminate by discipline and mortification all that stands in the way of its progress towards union with God. Now, in researching the many sources out there for spiritual awakening, it immediately becomes apparent that the best-selling books and the most watched videos express what appears to me as spiritual narcissism and spiritual materialism. And so it's no surprise this stage, purgation, is often downplayed and called something else, which lifts much of the responsibility off our shoulders. Often the negative energy discussed is strictly from our culture, which gives us limiting beliefs. And this is true. Limiting beliefs are something we need to purge ourselves of, but there is more than that. This is the stage of taking personal responsibility for what we've experienced in life. Taking responsibility, not only for the harm done to us, but the harm we have inflicted on ourselves and others. And many people short circuit the process at this stage. Next, we have illumination. Here is where we begin to feel a lightness, because much of the burden of karma and guilt have been lifted. We are less attached to the things of this world, to the desires of ego. We want to do those things and explore those places that bring us greater connection to ourselves, to others, and to Source or the divine. Usually, this is a time of study and contemplation, as well as the beginning of outward focus when we want to serve others. Again, about this stage, Underhill states, when by purgation the self has become detached from the things of sense and acquired those virtues which are the ornaments of the spiritual marriage, its joyful consciousness of the transcendent order returns in an enhanced form. Like the prisoners in Plato's cave of illusion, it has awakened to knowledge of reality, has struggled up the harsh and difficult path to the mouth of the cave. Now it looks upon the sun. No surprise, this stage is often characterized by deep feelings of peace and contentment and joy. However, Underhill offers a warning to those at this stage, one I alluded to earlier. In persons of feeble or diffuse intelligence, and above all, in victims of self-regarding spirituality, this deep absorption in the sense of divine reality may easily degenerate into a monoideism, that's defined by Merriam-Webster as a state of prolonged absorption in a single idea, just so you know. Then the shady side of illumination, a selfish preoccupation with transcendental joys, the spiritual gluttony condemned by St. John of the Cross comes out. I get a sense that some of these spiritual gurus I watched on TV or on the web in preparation for this presentation might indeed suffer from this shady side of illumination. And now here is the most mysterious, perhaps, stage of the spiritual journey, the dark night of the soul. Some life coaches use this term for the purgative stage because the term purgative just isn't that appealing. And then they call this stage the void or something else. It is the most difficult stage because it is often accompanied by the withdrawal of energy from us, resulting in depression, anxiety, and feelings of abandonment. Underhill states, in the development of the great and strenuous seekers after God, this is followed or sometimes intermittently accompanied by the most terrible of all the experiences of the mystic way, the final and complete purification of the self, which is called by some contemplatives the mystic pain or mystic death, by others the purification of the spirit or dark night of the soul. Now that doesn't sound very appealing, does it? The consciousness which had in illumination sunned itself in the sense of the divine presence now suffers under an equally intense sense of the divine absence. Learning to disassociate the personal satisfaction of mystical vision from the reality of mystical life. Friends, this is a time when all the attachments of ego to this material world are laid bare and stripped away if one surrenders to the process. And not everyone does. Some get out of this stage as quickly as they can. Others who do go through it will say that if they're lucky, it takes months to get through it, but often It takes years to fully get through this process. Well, I said the dark night of the soul was the most mysterious stage. Maybe this one is because it's so rare. Often what happens is after a brief taste of the dark night, people will abort the mission and try to go back to the illumination or the awakening state. It's completely understandable since those stages are far more enjoyable. But remember that spiritual narcissism is a temptation at both the awakening and the illumination phases. We might be able to recall examples of spiritual leaders, gurus who evoke not humility, but spiritual indulgence, spiritual gluttony that Underhill speaks of. Union is the true goal of the mystic, of the saint, complete spiritual ascent and the culmination of the awakening process. In this state, the absolute life is not merely perceived and enjoyed by the self as an illumination, but it is one with it. It is the state of pure spiritual living where joy and enhanced powers are continually experienced, where literally heaven is experienced on earth. Now, this is quite an aspiration. And many of the life coaches out there tone it down and call this stage the mission or purpose stage. And that's probably a good way to describe it as well. When one does not receive full union, but one has definitely gone through a dark night, one does often experience a clear sense of mission or purpose. And that's what happened to me. When I went through this process from the ages of 17 and 19, and many people go through this process multiple times in their life. But when I was a teenager, I felt a tremendous sense of clarity about what I was to do with my life. And that was to be a missionary of sorts. Maybe some of you have experienced this as well. Now, I don't want to presume that every person wants to go through the stages of spiritual awakening. And so I will close with this question again. Do you want to experience spiritual awakening? If you've gone through this process before, do you want to experience it again? Because it doesn't have to be a one-time experience. And if you have gone through one or more of the stages, are you willing to share your experience with others? At this time, I'm going to invite you that opportunity. Any one of you who has been through one or more of these stages, I'd appreciate it, and our community would appreciate it, if you would share with us briefly, if you can, if that's possible, your experience. We'd love to hear about it.